Hi guys, AmazingOomoo's here. A lot of you asked me I offered to make some tutorials, and you all said you'd be very keen to see some logic tutorials. So today I thought I'd show you how to collect a pickup in Dreams with your puppet. As you can see, I've put together a very complicated scene. I'm very proud of it. I made this puppet from scratch. I did actually make this cube from scratch. Very pleased with it. Basically what I did was I used the cube stamp, and that's it. So first of all, I'll show you how to use a microchip. So if you go over to the gadgets section, a microchip is in logic and processing, and it's this sort of pitchfork symbol. So use L1 to surface snap this to your item. This is important, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Place down a microchip. Now if you use L1 and X to scope into it, you can see there's nothing inside. And that just keeps your logic neat and tidy. Rather than having it all spilling out in the scene, it keeps it neat and tidy. You should also name the item up here. It's really important that you get into the habit of naming every item, because you will struggle to remember what does what otherwise. Once your scene gets more and more complicated, you will really struggle to remember what logic does what if it's all just called microchip. So now that we've got the microchip set up for the item, we're going to input a trigger zone to detect when the player walks into a trigger zone. So that's over here in sensors and input. On the far left is a trigger zone. So we're going to stamp that down on the left hand side. Now it's important that you keep your logic flowing from left to right as well, because that keeps it, again, neat, clean, tidy, so that you can make sense of what you're seeing. So when you use L1 and square to tweak the trigger zone, you can see the trigger zone itself becomes visible, this big green sphere. And we just want that to be a little bit smaller. It's a little too big. So I'm just going to scale that down until it's sort of a decent size for the player to walk in and pick the item up, but not too big that they can pick it up half a mile away. You can see also the player is flashing green, meaning that that character will be picked up automatically when the the trigger zone will detect that puppet as soon as you walk into it. So you can come out of that. Now we're going to leave this alone for a moment and instead scope into the puppet, and then scope into the chip down here. Now you can see it's called puppet logic. And although it's got this trophy symbol on it, in the bottom right hand corner is the microchip symbol again, meaning that this is in fact a microchip. And you can scope into that and you can see the sort of inner brain of the puppet itself. And again, you can see you've got more microchips here. Although they've got a different symbol on them, they all are microchips. Now, the controller logic is the one we're interested in at the moment, this orange one with the controller symbol. So scope into that one and another microchip will open up. Here you've got your health manager, your controller sensor and your puppet interface. And again, you can see that the inputs flow from the left towards the outputs on the right. So for example here, the left stick is the input. You're inputting a signal with the left stick and it outputs that signal to the walk animation. And it's important that you keep that flowing left to right, because all of the logic chips are designed in that way to flow from left to right. So it just makes it easy and simple to read if you keep that format. And again, you can name all of these items as well. So if you open up with Control and X, I nearly said, L1 and square to tweak the controller sensor, you can see you've got all of the buttons here as outputs. You can then output to various different logic chips throughout your world. So if you have a look through, so something I've already done is if you go over here to the Important Properties tab, there's a button down here that says Force Possession. You can just press X to turn that on. And that means that when you press play, your imp automatically jumps straight into the character. So that's something small that you can keep in mind. What we're looking at today is the triangle output, which is here. There's the triangle button. and pressing that over there will simulate the triangle button being pressed, but only while you're holding down X. So this output is what we want, and we could output that directly into the microchip, but that's going to get very messy. If you have 20 items to be collected throughout the level, and you've got the triangle button outputting to all of those 20 items, you're going to have 20 wires flowing across the world into your puppet, into a triangle input on this controller sensor, and it's just really, really messy, ugly way to do it. So the best way I found of doing this, if you go over to your gadgets, and then again in sensors and input, a wireless transmitter, and just stamp that down, and make sure that you name this something important like triangle, and I'll show you why for that in a moment. But for now, tweak your controller sensor again, grab your controller, your triangle output on the right here, and plug that into the signal to receiver. Don't worry about the power on the bottom. This gadget is already powered on unless you power it off with some sort of input that then powers it on later. So just plug the triangle output into the signal to receiver. And that will now transmit the triangle button around your entire scene, and that can be picked up by a wireless receiver. So we can close this down for now, and you can put in your item pickup, you can pick up a wireless receiver. So we're going to put that down here. Now if you tweak this, you'll need to enter, you'll see here it says enter transmitter name. This is why it's important that you name your transmitter. You'll probably want a few different wireless transmitters throughout your level, and it's important that you name them unique things that are easy to remember so that you can refer back to them later. So we're just going to put in here triangle, and that will now pick up the triangle signal from your controller whenever you press that, even though there's no wires hanging around clogging up your scene, and you can duplicate that throughout hundreds of different items. And when we're done here, you can duplicate this item and it will automatically and immediately work. It's a brilliant system that Media Molecule have created here. It's absolutely genius, and that would just, you can just stamp that down throughout your scene. If you highlight the microchip, and the item, you can then save as a new creation and stamp that down as many times as you want, and it will work out of the box. So you may have noticed when moving this around, and now when tweaking it, this green trigger sphere appears again. Now you could just use the trigger zone with the wireless receiver and not bother with this trigger zone up here. I find it is easiest if you have no trigger zones on your wireless receivers, because some of them could have trigger zones. For example, this one could have a trigger zone. Some of them may not have a trigger zone, and it's important that it's easy for me to remember that wireless receivers don't have trigger zones, and you have a separate item for a trigger zone, and that's what I use for a trigger zone. I don't use a wireless receiver. So if you go over to the trigger zone section, you can turn it off here and just make it apply to the entire scene. So that will pick up triangle wherever you press it in the entire scene. So we're now going to add a way for the item to be destroyed when picked up, because after you picked it up, you don't want it hanging around. So in movers and output, you'll find a picture of the skull, which is the destroyer. Now, another benefit to having hold L1 when you put down the microchip and snap it to surface is that that destroyer will automatically apply to this item. You won't now have to wire them up, because that microchip is attached to that item. The destroyer applies to the microchip, which applies to the item. Now we can't just wire these three things together like this. If we do this, and then we play, if you press triangle, no matter where you are, the item will be destroyed. And if you enter the trigger zone, even without pressing triangle, the item will be destroyed. That isn't what we want. What we want is it to only destroy the item when the trigger zone is entered and the player press triangle. And for that, we're going to use an AND gate, which is in logic and processing. Here's your AND gate. An AND gate will only turn on from here will only turn on when all of the inputs are also switched on. So you've also got an OR gate over here, which will turn on when any of the inputs is on, even if the rest of them are off. If one input is on, the OR gate will turn on. And they both have different uses. So for now, you're going to connect your trigger zone to input A and your wireless receiver to input B. Now, as you can see, more up here. You can have up to 10, and they will all have to be on in order for the AND gate to power on. But we only need 2 for now. So that will now destroy the item only when the player is in the trigger zone and when they press triangle. Ta-da! But if you're stood over here and you press, no, don't fall off the edge. If you're stood over here and you press triangle, nothing happens. You enter the trigger zone, nothing happens. But if you do both at the same time, the item is destroyed. And that's what we want. So we're already halfway through making our pickup. It's quite simple, but it just shows you the basics of how this works. We'd like to have an animation to animate the player picking up the item. So for that, you'll want a timeline. You could just do it with one single keyframe. I prefer to do this sort of thing with a timeline because if you wanted to add sound effects in, you wanted the item to light up or explode, you'll want to do that in the middle of the timeline rather than immediately, because you'll want to do it when the player makes contact with the item, bending down to pick it up. So if we scope into this, add a keyframe at the beginning, scope back into our puppet, and you can see now you can highlight individual items on the puppet. If you hover over the pelvis, this will move the whole puppet, but the feet will stay flat on the floor. So you can grab that at the pelvis and move it down like this. And that just animates a simple picking up animation. You can obviously spend a bit more time making it better for how you want it, but that's good enough for now. Make sure that you make this timeline only the length of what's actually in the timeline. And you'll want to make this keyframe longer, like this. And you'll want to have a bit of a slow power up, so that he doesn't immediately jump on the item. There's a bit of a slow bend down and pick up. Make sure you keep your timeline only as long as the frames within it, because otherwise there will be a lot of, the timeline will carry on playing. Although there won't be anything in it, the timeline will carry on playing, and that could mess up future events you want to trigger at the end of the timeline if you wanted to. So that's not going to do anything now because we haven't wired it up. Just to check to see whether it works, you could wire up the result from your AND gate to also activate this timeline. And he now bends down to pick up the item. And the item does disappear before he's finished picking it up. So what you could do is, rather than have that wired onto there, you could have a keyframe midway along. You'll want, before you record the keyframe, you'll want to make sure you go into your destroyer and turn it off, because you will then animate your keyframe, go into the destroyer and power it on, and you can see, as mentioned in the tutorial, those hashed lines appear over the item, meaning it's been animated. So that will now only destroy the item midway through the animation. Another small thing you'll want to do is make sure you set this timeline to play once rather than sustain, because otherwise you'll have to hold triangle down. And he'll now bend down to pick the item up. And you can tweak that and play around with that as much as you want to make sure it's perfect to how you want it. We're just getting the basics down at the moment. So what we don't want is that wire between the scenes, and that keyframe in here is only going to activate one item. So it's probably easier if you want to try and keep your logic separate. So animations for the puppet go on the puppet, animations for the microchip go on the microchip. You need to keep them separate like that. So what you could have instead is a timer, and on this timer make it 0.8 seconds long. You start the timer here, so the AND gate activates the timer, and then when the timer is finished it outputs a pulse which powers on the destroyer, which now means there'll be a slight pause. Only now the animation isn't turning on, because we don't want to wire the animation to the item, because you won't be able to duplicate that throughout the scene. So you'll now need another wireless transmitter, and we're going to label that pickup. And connect that like that, and then we'll have over here, we'll have a wireless receiver, and we're going to need to put the transmitter name in here, pickup, and again make sure you turn the zone off, because now the zone is attached to the puppet rather than the item, and it just gets complicated, so it's easier to make it scene related. And the signal from the transmitter then goes to power the animation. So if we now play, and the item's now picked up, and there's a little bit of a delay there which adds to the realism of the item being picked up only when the player's hand touches it. So the item's been picked up, but that hasn't been acknowledged anywhere that the item's actually been picked up. Now you can see already we've got this is starting to get a little bit complicated, so we'll go ahead and put another microchip down. And again, you mustn't forget to name this microchip. And that then keeps your logic nice and tidy. So you've got your jump animation, run, and now you've got pick up as well. And it's just important to make it clean and tidy like that, because like I say, you've got one pickup at the moment. Once you start adding in jumps and rolls and things like that, it will start getting more and more complicated. So in here you can add in how to detect when the pickup has been picked up and add a score to the screen. So for that we will need a variable and a variable modifier. Now the variable is basically a storage, as it shows on the box, as it shows on the symbol. It's like a box. You can just put stuff in this box, and you'll need one variable for each type of item. So in this case, if we wanted 20 cubes throughout, we just need the one variable. But if you also wanted to pick up spheres, you might want another variable to detect how many spheres you've picked up. So going into this variable, again, you can name it. And if you're planning on having multiple scenes all in one dream that tracks the number of pickups across the multiple scenes, so for example, if you wanted to pick up a key in the first stage that you wanted to use in a door in the third stage, you'd want to use this picture of a map here that says persist in dream. And that will apply across all scenes within that one dream. So that variable is just a variable. That won't do anything at the moment. What you might want to have in move as an output is a number displayer. And that will display a number. As you hover over it, you'll see a number appearing on the right hand side of the screen there. On the left hand side of the screen, other right. So when you open up the variable, and you want the current value from here, and plug that into the number range. Now again, you don't need to worry about the power there, because if you power it off, you know, it's already powered on. So that will now, as you play the game, display a number in the left hand side of the screen. But that hasn't increased because we haven't added in a variable modifier. And you'd want to do that on your item rather than in your puppet, because that would then duplicate across items. So you may have noticed right next to the variable was the variable modifier. So we'll stamp that down in our microchip, and that is going to, you've got set, get, add, or reset. You'll notice that there isn't a subtract, but that doesn't matter. You can just use add, and then this goes into minus figures. We're going to set this to 1, so it's probably easier to use the directional buttons to increase that to 1. Now again, similar with the wireless transmitters, this item is wireless. You will need to enter the name of the variable. So we're going to name this variable cube. And then we enter the name of the variable in the variable modifier. And now we wire up that AND gate to power on the variable modifier. And if we play our scene, that's then increased to 1. Now again, it may be better for you if you wanted to wire out the output from the timer to power on the variable modifier, so that the item is destroyed at the same time that the count goes up. Like that. So that's how you pick up an item. And then, as I say, you can just duplicate this item throughout your game. And as you play, you'll be able to pick up like that. I hope that was helpful. There are a few other things you can do. For example, you could disable puppet animations, which whilst picking up an item, which you would need a keyframe for. So down here, there's a disable controls, and you'd need a switch attached to that to switch that on using a keyframe, and that's why you need to have it as a full animation rather than just a single keyframe, because you'll need to put a keyframe at the beginning to disable animations, like I say, sound effects, things like that. But now that item is duplicatable. You can replicate that in any level as long as you've got that same puppet with the character logic as well. You can then simply duplicate that, run over here and pick it up, and it counts every time. Thanks for watching. Let me know what tutorial you'd like me to make next. I don't really like the whole subscribe and like this page, but you know, if you want a specific thing tutorial next, then just let me know and I'll probably be happy to do it if I know how. Thanks very much. Goodbye.